John Bennett adjusted the leather strap on his carry-on bag as he navigated through the crowded terminal. The airport buzzed with the usual energy, travelers rushing toward their gates, the crackle of announcements over the loudspeakers, and the occasional laughter from a group of excited vacationers. But John wasn't just another passenger, he was a pilot. At 45, John had spent more time in the sky than most people did on the ground. His passion for flying had taken him across the globe, but today was different. Today, he wasn't piloting a commercial jet. He was just a passenger, finally taking some much-needed time for himself. After years of hard work and overcoming countless hurdles, both professional and personal, he was ready for a break. He approached the first-class line, adjusting his grip on his carry-on. He noticed the glances from fellow passengers, subtle but noticeable, assessing him. As a tall, well-dressed black man, John had grown accustomed to this type of scrutiny. He took a deep breath and let the familiar scent of jet fuel calm his nerves. John had faced bias throughout his career. People had doubted him, questioned his abilities, and made assumptions based solely on the color of his skin. But none of that had stopped him. He had proven time and time again that he belonged in the cockpit. But today was supposed to be different. He wasn't here to prove anything. He just wanted to relax, enjoy a first-class seat, and look forward to a much-needed vacation. The line for first class moved quickly, and John soon found himself face-to-face with Sarah Miller, the blonde flight attendant stationed at the boarding gate. Her uniform was immaculate, her makeup flawless, but her smile was thin and forced when she saw him. The change in her demeanor was subtle, but John noticed it immediately. "Excuse me, sir," Sarah said, her voice oozing politeness with a hint of sarcasm as she emphasized the word sir. "Are you sure you're in the right line? Economy is back there." John's heart sank. It was a familiar feeling, being judged, being questioned. But he wasn't about to let it get to him. He simply smiled and handed her his boarding pass. Sarah took it with a sharp snap, her eyes scanning the details before flicking up to meet his. Her expression tightened for a moment, betraying her surprise, but she quickly recovered. "I see," she muttered, thrusting the pass back into his hand. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Bennett." John caught the eye roll just as she turned away, muttering under her breath, "Guess they're letting anyone fly first class these days." He stood there for a second, his grip tightening on the boarding pass. He considered saying something, calling her out on her behavior, but then shook his head. It wasn't worth it. He had dealt with worse. Without a word, he walked past her and down the jet bridge toward the plane. Behind him, Sarah turned to her colleague at the gate, James, a younger attendant with a nervous energy about him. "Did you see that?" she whispered, a smirk on her lips. James frowned, glancing after John. "Maybe you should ease up," he said quietly, his voice filled with unease. Sarah shrugged, already dismissing John as just another difficult passenger. As John entered the plane, the familiar hum of the engines and the scent of the cabin immediately made him feel at home. Despite the tension at the gate, there was something comforting about being on an aircraft. It was where he belonged, where he felt in control. But today he was just another passenger, and for the first time in a long while, he was okay with that. He stowed his carry-on and settled into his first-class seat. The plush leather embraced him, and for a moment he closed his eyes, willing himself to relax. But even here, in this space meant for comfort, he could feel the eyes on him. Across the aisle, Margaret Sanders, a well-dressed businesswoman in her 50s, glanced at him curiously, her brows furrowing slightly before she turned back to her husband. The couple exchanged whispers, and though John couldn't hear the words, he knew the conversation all too well. The murmurs, the sideways glances, they weren't new. People like Margaret weren't expecting someone like him in first class, and they didn't bother hiding their surprise. John was used to it by now. Years of flying had taught him how to block it out, how to ignore the whispers and stay focused on what mattered. The crew moved through the aisles, preparing for takeoff. Sarah appeared again, her smile bright and professional as she offered drinks and snacks to the passengers. When she reached John, however, her demeanor changed. "Water?" she asked curtly, barely meeting his eyes as she placed a cup on his tray table. The water splashed over the edge slightly, and she made no effort to clean it up. "Thank you," John said, his tone calm but firm. Sarah didn't respond, turning quickly to the next passenger. Behind her, James lingered for a moment, his eyes meeting John's with an apologetic look. He wanted to say something. John could see it in his eyes, but he remained silent, moving on with his duties. John sighed, leaning back in his seat. It wasn't just the flight attendants. The other passengers had noticed the interaction too. They exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, others indifferent. No one said a word. It was moments like this that reminded John of the weight he carried. No matter how successful he was, no matter how hard he worked, there were always people who would see him as less. It was exhausting, but John had learned long ago that rising above it was the only way forward. As the plane taxied toward the runway, John's mind drifted. He thought of his early days in flight school, the challenges he faced, and the people who doubted him. He remembered the first time he sat in a cockpit, the thrill of lifting off the ground, leaving the world behind. Flying was his escape, his freedom. But no matter how high he flew, he couldn't escape the biases that kept trying to drag him down. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dinged off, and the flight crew began their service. The cabin hummed with quiet conversation, the clink of glasses, and the rustling of snack packages. John had hoped to fade into the background, to enjoy the peace and quiet, but the tension from earlier still hung in the air. Sarah moved through the aisles, her demeanor shifting as she interacted with other passengers. She smiled brightly at the couple next to him, her tone sweet and accommodating. But when she reached John's row, her smile vanished. She placed his meal tray down with a thud, the silverware rattling loudly. "Anything else?" she asked, her voice sharp, not bothering to make eye contact. John shook his head, choosing not to engage. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of knowing she had gotten under his skin. He had come here to relax, and that was what he intended to do. As Sarah moved on, John couldn't help but notice Alex, the younger flight attendant, watching the interaction from the galley. His brow was furrowed and his lips pressed into a thin line. John could see the conflict in the young man's eyes, the desire to say something, to stand up for what was right. But like so many others, Alex chose silence. In the front row, Margaret continued to watch John. This time, however, her expression had softened. She had seen Sarah's behavior, and though she hadn't spoken up, John could tell that it bothered her. John sighed, taking a sip of his water. The turbulence of emotions was worse than the actual flight. He just wanted to get through this journey in peace. As the plane soared through the clouds, John leaned his head back and closed his eyes, trying to block out the world around him. He thought of home, of his family, and of the career he had worked so hard to build. The skies had always been his refuge, but today, even here, prejudice had followed him. Little did he know, this flight was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would challenge not only his skills as a pilot, but the very core of his strength as a person. John was just beginning to drift off, his mind finally settling after the tense interactions earlier, when the plane shuddered violently. The sudden jolt startled everyone on board. Passengers gripped their armrests as drinks and trays clattered on the tables. The seatbelt sign dinged back on, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a bit of turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." John instinctively tightened his belt, his pilot's instincts already analyzing the situation. Turbulence like this wasn't unusual, but something about the way the plane dipped and swayed felt off. He glanced around the cabin. The tension was palpable. Passengers looked at each other nervously, their previous discomfort replaced by fear. Sarah and Alex were moving quickly through the cabin, ensuring everyone was buckled in. Sarah's face, usually so composed, now showed a hint of anxiety. Even she couldn't hide her discomfort in the face of this unexpected turbulence. As John gazed out the window, he saw the dark clouds gathering. The plane lurched again, more violently this time, and John's fingers clenched the armrest. This was more than just a passing bump in the air. The atmosphere had changed, and John knew that something wasn't right. The plane dipped suddenly, causing gasps from passengers and sending a few overhead bags crashing down. John's muscles tensed, his body on high alert. Every instinct in him screamed that something was wrong. He knew this feeling all too well. It was the precursor to a potential disaster. In his peripheral vision, he saw Alex approach Sarah at the front of the cabin. They exchanged worried glances, and John strained to hear their conversation over the hum of the engines and the nervous whispers from other passengers. Sarah gave a quick nod and disappeared toward the cockpit. Moments later, the captain's voice came over the intercom again, but this time there was an edge to it. "We've hit an unexpected weather pattern, and we're working to adjust our course. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." John's pulse quickened. He could hear the stress in the captain's voice, something passengers might not pick up on, but a pilot certainly would. Suddenly, the plane took a sharp drop, and screams filled the cabin. The co-pilot's voice crackled over the speakers, trying to maintain calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered severe turbulence, but we are working on stabilizing the aircraft." But John could tell from the tone of the announcement that things were far worse than the passengers were being led to believe. His mind raced through possible scenarios. Mechanical failure? A sudden storm front? Whatever it was clear that this was no routine turbulence. Just as John began to contemplate his next move, a flight attendant, Brian, rushed out of the cockpit and straight toward Sarah. His face was pale, and he whispered something urgently to her. Sarah's expression went from concern to full-blown panic. John's instincts kicked in. Something was seriously wrong. He unbuckled his seatbelt, despite the warning lights, and stood. The plane rocked violently again, forcing him to grip the seat in front of him for balance. He approached the group of flight attendants who were now huddled near the cockpit door, their faces etched with fear. "Excuse me," John said firmly, his calm voice cutting through the chaos. "I'm a pilot. Is everything okay?" Sarah turned, her eyes wide with panic. "The captain, he's collapsed. It's his heart. The co-pilot is trying to keep control, but—" John's breath caught. The captain had collapsed mid-flight, in the middle of this storm. His eyes moved past Sarah toward the cockpit door. He needed to be in there. "Now, I can help," John said, already moving toward the door. "Let me speak with the co-pilot." But Sarah's panic morphed into disbelief. "You? A pilot?" Her voice was a mix of shock and skepticism, as if she couldn't believe the man she had been dismissing the entire flight was now offering to help save them. John's patience, already worn thin by the earlier interactions, was gone. "Yes, I'm a pilot, and unless you want the situation to get worse, you need to let me in there." Sarah hesitated for a moment, glancing at the other attendants. But Alex, standing behind her, spoke up. "Let him in," he said, his voice steady. "If he's a pilot, we need all the help we can get." Sarah reluctantly stepped aside, and John quickly moved toward the cockpit. Alex keyed in the security code with shaking hands, and the door swung open. John stepped into the cockpit, and the scene before him was one of controlled chaos. The co-pilot, Matt, was gripping the controls with white-knuckled intensity, his face slick with sweat. Warning lights flashed across the instrument panel, and the plane shook violently as it passed through another pocket of turbulence. The captain was slumped in his seat, unconscious, his breathing shallow. The plane was effectively flying with only one pilot, and from the look on Matt's face, he was barely holding on. "Thank God," Matt breathed, his relief palpable when he saw John. "I can't do this alone." John didn't waste any time. He slid into the captain's seat, quickly assessing the situation. "What's our altitude?" "Descending fast," Matt replied, his voice strained. "We're at 20,000 feet and dropping. I've tried to stabilize, but the turbulence—" John nodded, his focus already on the controls. "All right, we need to get out of this turbulence and back to a safe altitude." He took the controls, his hands steady as he began adjusting the plane's course. His years of experience in the cockpit came flooding back. This was where he belonged, at the helm, in control. The chaos outside the plane didn't matter. What mattered was keeping the plane and its passengers safe. John's fingers danced over the instrument panel, making slight adjustments as he communicated with air traffic control. "This is Delta 417, John said, his voice calm and authoritative. "We're experiencing a medical emergency. The captain is incapacitated, and I am now piloting the aircraft, requesting immediate diversion to the nearest available airport." The response from the tower was immediate. "Delta 417, roger that. You're cleared for emergency landing at Newark Liberty International. Prepare for approach." Matt watched John with a mix of awe and relief. "You've got this," he said, his voice shaky but hopeful. John stepped into the cockpit, and the scene before him was one of controlled chaos. The co-pilot, Matt, was gripping the controls with white-knuckled intensity, his face slick with sweat. Warning lights flashed across the instrument panel, and the plane shook violently as it passed through another pocket of turbulence. The captain was slumped in his seat, unconscious, his breathing shallow. The plane was effectively flying with only one pilot, and from the look on Matt's face, he was barely holding on. "Thank God," Matt breathed, his relief palpable when he saw John. "I can't do this alone." John didn't waste any time. He slid into the captain's seat, quickly assessing the situation. "What's our altitude?" "Descending fast," Matt replied, his voice strained. "We're at 20,000 feet and dropping. I've tried to stabilize, but the turbulence—" John nodded, his focus already on the controls. "All right, we need to get out of this turbulence and back to a safe altitude." He took the controls, his hands steady as he began adjusting the plane's course. His years of experience in the cockpit came flooding back. This was where he belonged. At the helm, in control. The chaos outside the plane didn't matter. What mattered was keeping the plane and its passengers safe. John's fingers danced over the instrument panel, making slight adjustments as he communicated with air traffic control. "This is Delta 417, John said, his voice calm and authoritative. "We're experiencing a medical emergency. The captain is incapacitated, and I am now piloting the aircraft, requesting immediate diversion to the nearest available airport." The response from the tower was immediate. "Delta 417, roger that. You're cleared for emergency landing at Newark Liberty International. Prepare for approach." Matt watched John with a mix of awe and relief. "You've got this," he said, his voice shaky but hopeful. John nodded, his concentration unbroken. "We're going to get through this. Just stay with me." Outside, the storm continued to rage, the plane shuddering under the pressure, but John's hands remained steady on the controls. He had flown through worse. The key now was staying calm, keeping the plane level, and getting them safely to the ground. The turbulence had grown worse, the plane now dipping and swaying as if caught in a fierce battle with the skies. Every jolt was a reminder of just how precarious their situation was. The passengers, unaware of the details, were gripped with fear. The cabin was filled with the sound of muffled sobs and panicked whispers. Back in the cockpit, John and Matt worked in tandem, adjusting the plane's trajectory. They were still descending, but John had managed to regain some control. He knew, though, that they weren't out of danger yet. The storm was still raging, and they needed to land fast. "All right," John said, his voice calm but firm. "We're on course for Newark, but we've got to stabilize before we hit the approach." Matt nodded, his hands shaking slightly as he worked the radio. "We've got clearance for an emergency landing. Air traffic control is clearing the runway." John adjusted the throttle, his focus razor sharp. "We're going to need to compensate for that crosswind. It's going to be tricky." Matt glanced at him. "Can you do it?" John didn't hesitate. "We don't have a choice." He could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of every life on board resting squarely on his shoulders. But this was what he did. This was why he had trained so hard, pushed through so many barriers. All those years of being doubted, of having to prove himself, had led to this moment. As they neared the airport, John could see the runway lights in the distance, barely visible through the storm. He began to prepare for the landing, adjusting the plane's descent angle, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. "Flaps down," he instructed, and Matt quickly complied. The plane shuddered as it descended through the final layers of turbulence, the runway now just a few hundred feet away. John's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was clear. This was it, the moment of truth. At the last second, a powerful gust of wind slammed into the plane, throwing it off course. The wheels were just seconds from touching down, and the sudden shift threatened to tip the plane sideways. John reacted instantly, adjusting the controls with precision. The plane dipped slightly, then leveled off just as the wheels made contact with the runway. There was a jolt, then a roar as the plane's engines slowed to a crawl. They had landed. The cabin was silent for a moment, as if the passengers couldn't quite believe they had made it. Then slowly the tension broke, and the sound of applause filled the plane. People cheered, clapped, and some even wept with relief. In the cockpit, John let out a long breath, his hands finally releasing their grip on the controls. He exchanged a look with Matt, who was grinning, the weight of the situation finally lifting from his shoulders. "You did it," Matt said, his voice filled with awe. "You saved us." John nodded, but there was no pride in his expression, only quiet resolve. This was what he had trained for, what he had dedicated his life to. But the looks of disbelief and doubt from earlier in the flight still lingered in his mind. As he and Matt completed the final shutdown procedures, the cabin door opened and Sarah entered. Her face was pale, her earlier bravado completely gone. She looked at John with wide, disbelieving eyes, as if she couldn't quite reconcile the man she had dismissed with the hero who had just saved her life. "John," she started, her voice trembling. I, I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry." John looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. He could see the genuine remorse in her eyes, but this wasn't the time for apologies. Lives had been at stake, and prejudice almost got in the way. He nodded curtly, standing up from the captain's seat. "Let's just make sure everyone gets off the plane safely." Sarah nodded quickly, stepping aside as John made his way out of the cockpit. He didn't need the recognition or the praise. He just wanted to know that everyone was safe. As John stepped into the cabin, the applause grew louder. The passengers, many of whom had judged him just like Sarah, now looked at him with awe and gratitude. John didn't bask in the attention, though. He simply nodded in acknowledgement, moving through the crowd toward the exit. Outside, the storm had cleared, and the runway was bathed in soft, golden light. John stood there for a moment, taking it all in. He had done his job, nothing more, nothing less. But today had been about more than just saving lives. It had been about proving something, not just to the world, but to himself. The passengers exited the plane, moving slowly, still shaken from the ordeal. John stood near the exit, watching as they filed out. Some glanced at him with gratitude, offering quiet thanks. Others remained silent, still processing what had happened. Among them was Margaret, the businesswoman who had eyed John with skepticism earlier. She paused in front of him, her face a mix of relief and remorse. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I misjudged you." John nodded, acknowledging her words but feeling no need for validation. He had learned long ago that judgments based on appearance said more about the person making them than the one receiving them. "I'm glad you're safe," he replied simply. As the last of the passengers disembarked, Sarah approached him again, her steps hesitant. Gone was the confident, somewhat haughty demeanor she had displayed at the beginning of the flight. Now she looked vulnerable, her eyes red from what appeared to be tears. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I, I didn't believe in you. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and you saved us all. I don't know how to even begin making up for that." John studied her for a moment. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the guilt weighing on her shoulders. But he also knew that apologies were only the beginning. "What matters is what you do from here," he said. "It's not about apologizing. It's about changing." Sarah swallowed hard, nodding as her eyes brimmed with tears. "I will." John offered her a small, reassuring nod before turning toward the exit. As he stepped out of the plane, the cool evening air hit his face, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the flight. A group of airline officials stood waiting, their expressions a mixture of relief and respect. "Mr. Bennett," one of them said, stepping forward with an outstretched hand. "David Parker, Senior Operations Manager for Delta. On behalf of the airline, I want to thank you for your actions today. You saved everyone on that plane." John shook his hand firmly but remained humble. "I did what I had to do." David smiled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. "We'd like to talk to you more about this," he said. "There are things we need to address as an airline, and I believe your input could help us make real changes." John didn't respond immediately. He had spent years battling the systemic biases that still lingered in the industry. The idea of being part of the solution intrigued him, but he wasn't ready to commit to anything just yet. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice calm. David nodded. "Take your time. We'll be in touch." As John turned to leave, the weight of the day began to settle on him. He had done what he was trained to do, but the emotional toll was heavier than he'd expected. It wasn't just about saving lives. It was about confronting the harsh realities of prejudice and how deeply ingrained they were, even in life or death situations. The following morning, John awoke in his hotel room, the events of the previous day still fresh in his mind. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, lighting up with notifications. News outlets had picked up the story. Hero pilot saves flight after captain collapses, and his name was all over the headlines. Social media was abuzz with praise, admiration, and, to John's surprise, outrage at the treatment he had received on the flight. He scrolled through the news articles, skimming the comments. Most of them were supportive, praising his bravery and skill, but others focused on the prejudice he had faced. The way Sarah had treated him, the judgment from other passengers, it was all being dissected in the public eye. Just then his phone rang. It was David Parker from Delta. "John, I hope I'm not disturbing you," David said, his tone serious. "I wanted to let you know that the airline is taking immediate steps to address what happened on your flight." John raised an eyebrow, unsure of what that meant. "What kind of steps?" "We're launching an internal investigation into the behavior of the crew," David explained. "I don't want to jump to conclusions, but what happened to you was unacceptable, and we need to ensure it never happens again. We're also implementing mandatory bias training for all our staff." John appreciated the gesture, but he knew that real change wouldn't come from a single training session. "It's a start," he said, "but there's more work to be done." David hesitated. "I agree, which is why I'd like to formally offer you a position as a consultant for Delta. We want you to help us reshape our diversity and inclusion programs to ensure that no one, passenger or crew, is ever treated the way you were." John was silent for a moment, weighing the offer. It was a big responsibility, and while he appreciated the opportunity to make a difference, he wasn't sure if he wanted to tie himself to a corporation that had only recently begun to acknowledge its flaws. "I'll need some time to think about it," John said finally. "This isn't a decision I can make lightly." "Of course," David said. "Take all the time you need." After hanging up, John sat back on the bed, contemplating his next move. He wasn't one to seek the spotlight, but if stepping into this role meant he could help prevent future incidents, like the one he'd experienced, it might be worth it. Later that afternoon, as John was leaving the hotel for a walk, he saw a familiar face near the lobby. Sarah. She was sitting alone in one of the chairs, her hands folded nervously in her lap. Her eyes flicked up when she saw him, and she stood immediately, making her way toward him. "John," she started, her voice shaky, I've been thinking about everything that happened yesterday. I know I apologize, but I feel like I need to do more. I was wrong, so wrong, and I want to make it right." John studied her for a moment, seeing the genuine remorse in her expression. He had been in this position before, people apologizing for their prejudices once they realized the weight of their actions. But this felt different. Sarah wasn't just offering a surface-level apology. She was grappling with the reality of who she had been, and that was never easy. "What do you plan to do?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. Sarah swallowed, her eyes welling with tears. "I've already spoken to David Parker. I asked to be transferred to a different department, something where I can focus on addressing the kind of behavior I exhibited. I want to help change things from the inside. I don't deserve to keep my position after what I did, but I'm hoping to use this experience to make sure it doesn't happen again." John nodded, appreciating her willingness to take responsibility. "It's not easy to admit when you're wrong," he said, "but the real change comes in what you do moving forward. Don't just apologize. Do better." Sarah wiped away a tear and nodded. "I will. I promise," John offered her a small smile, then turned and headed out the door. As much as Sarah's words resonated with him, he knew that real change wouldn't happen overnight. But it was a start, a small ripple that could lead to something bigger. John had barely returned from his walk when his phone buzzed again, this time with a text from an old friend. "Turn on the news. You're everywhere." Curious, he flipped on the TV and immediately saw his own face on the screen, along with the headline, "Pilot Saves Plane." Was he targeted by discrimination? A panel of commentators was debating the implications of what had happened on the flight, and it was clear that the story had taken on a life of its own. One of the commentators, a well-known civil rights activist, was speaking passionately. "This isn't just about one man saving a plane. It's about the systemic racism that permeates every aspect of our society, even in moments of crisis. The fact that John Bennett had to fight through bias to prove himself, even as he was saving lives, is a stark reminder of how far we still have to go. John watched, his emotions mixed. He had never wanted to be the center of a public debate, but here he was, thrust into the national conversation about race and prejudice. It wasn't just his actions that were being celebrated. It was the way he had been treated before anyone knew who he was or what he was capable of. His phone buzzed again, this time with calls from reporters wanting interviews. Everyone wanted to hear from the hero pilot, but John wasn't interested in playing that role. He had done his job, nothing more, nothing less. And while he appreciated the outpouring of support, he didn't want to be defined by this one moment. That evening, David Parker called again. "John, I know you're probably overwhelmed right now," he said, "but the media attention is growing, and we'd like to issue a statement." John sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want to be the face of this." "I understand," David replied, "but we also can't ignore what happened. People are paying attention, and we have an opportunity to make real change. If you're willing, I think we should make a joint statement, one that addresses the discrimination you faced, but also focuses on the steps we're taking to ensure this doesn't happen again." John thought about it. He didn't want the spotlight, but if his story could push the airline, and maybe the industry, to confront its biases, maybe it was worth speaking out. "All right," John said after a moment. "Let's do it." The next day, John and David held a press conference. Standing in front of a sea of cameras, John spoke honestly about his experience. Not just on this flight, but throughout his career as a black pilot. He didn't sugarcoat the challenges he had faced, but he also made it clear that this wasn't just about him. It was about changing a system that had long been stacked against people like him. As he finished speaking, the crowd erupted into applause. John wasn't seeking praise, but he felt a sense of accomplishment. Not because he had saved the plane, but because he had used the moment to push for something bigger than himself. The days that followed the press conference were a whirlwind. John received messages from people all over the world, pilots, passengers, and everyday people who had seen his story and were moved by it. Some shared their own experiences with discrimination, while others simply thanked him for speaking out. But with the praise also came the inevitable backlash. Some people accused John of playing the race card, while others downplayed the significance of what had happened, insisting that Sarah's behavior had nothing to do with race. John had expected this. He knew that confronting systemic issues always led to pushback, but it still stung. David Parker, however, was true to his word. The airline launched a full review of its policies and began working with outside consultants to develop a comprehensive diversity and inclusion program. John was invited to participate in the discussions, and though he was initially hesitant, he agreed. During the first meeting, John sat across from the airline's CEO, Amanda Reeves, a no-nonsense woman who had built her career on hard work and determination. She listened intently as John shared his insights, nodding thoughtfully. "I appreciate your honesty," Amanda said. "We've been blind to this issue for far too long, but that ends now. We're committed to making real changes, and we want you to be part of that process." John nodded, but he didn't let his guard down just yet. He had heard promises like this before. Talk of change without any real action. "I'll help," he said, "but only if you're serious about this. It can't just be lip service." Amanda met his gaze, her expression firm. "We're serious." Over the next several weeks, John worked closely with the airline's leadership team, offering his perspective on how they could improve their hiring practices, training programs, and overall company culture. He pushed for more diversity in leadership roles and emphasized the importance of not just hiring people from underrepresented backgrounds, but supporting them once they were on board. It wasn't easy. There were moments of frustration, moments when John wondered if he was making any difference at all. But slowly, he began to see progress. The airline's leadership team started taking his suggestions seriously, and new initiatives were rolled out. Despite the whirlwind of media attention and his new role as a consultant, John found time to reflect on everything that had happened. He often retreated to his small apartment, away from the noise of the outside world, where he could think clearly. One night as he sat by the window overlooking the city, his phone buzzed with a text from his daughter, Simone. She was away at college, studying to become an engineer, and though they talked often, she hadn't yet had a chance to fully process what had happened. "Dad," the text read, "I'm so proud of you." John smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He had always been close with Simone, and he knew she understood the significance of what he had done, not just in landing the plane, but in standing up for what was right. "Thanks, sweetheart," he replied. "How's school?" "Good," Simone texted back. "Busy, but good. I'm actually working on a project about bias in STEM fields, and I was wondering if you could help me with it. After everything that's happened, I think your perspective would be really helpful." John's smile grew. Simone had always been passionate about using her voice to advocate for change, just like him. He was proud of the woman she was becoming. "Of course," he replied. "Let's talk this weekend." As he put his phone down, John felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had always been driven by a desire to prove himself, to show the world that he belonged in the cockpit. But now he realized that it wasn't just about him. It was about the next generation, people like Simone, who would carry the torch forward and continue the fight for justice. The months after the emergency landing were transformative, not just for John, but for the airline industry as a whole. John had become a voice for change, not because he sought it, but because people needed to hear it. His speeches at aviation conferences, universities, and even on social media resonated with a wide audience. One particular event stood out, a keynote speech he was invited to give at a major aviation conference. The room was packed with pilots, executives, and aspiring aviators, many of whom had followed John's journey closely. As he stepped onto the stage, the applause was deafening, but John remained composed. He took a deep breath, looking out at the crowd. "Thank you," he began, his voice calm but strong. "I'm honored to be here today, but I want to make one thing clear. This isn't about me. It's about the systemic issues that still plague our industry, and many others." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I didn't become a pilot to prove anything to anyone. I became a pilot because I love flying. But along the way, I had to prove myself over and over again, not because of my skills, but because of the color of my skin. That's the reality for too many people in this industry." John's voice grew more passionate as he continued. "What happened on that flight wasn't just a personal experience. It was a reflection of the larger problem. Prejudice, whether overt or subtle, has no place in our industry, and we have a responsibility to confront it, not just as individuals, but as an entire community." The audience was silent, hanging on his every word. "I'm standing here today because I believe we can do better," John said, his voice resolute. "But it's going to take all of us. We have to recognize our own biases, challenge the systems that perpetuate inequality, and commit to making real, lasting change." As John finished his speech, the room erupted into applause. But this time, it wasn't the applause of admiration. It was the applause of understanding, of a shared commitment to something greater. John stepped off the stage feeling a sense of accomplishment. He had said what needed to be said, and now it was up to the industry to follow through. As the conference came to a close, John was approached by a group of young pilots, their eyes wide with admiration. "Thank you, Captain Bennett," one of them said. "You've inspired us more than you know." John smiled warmly. "It's not just about inspiration," he said. "It's about action. Keep pushing. Keep challenging. That's how we make a difference." Months had passed since the emergency landing, and life had taken on a new rhythm for John Bennett. He had settled into his role as a consultant for Delta, working closely with their leadership on diversity initiatives and mentoring young pilots from underrepresented backgrounds. The media attention had faded, but the changes he had pushed for were only just beginning to take root. On a brisk fall morning, John arrived at Delta's headquarters for a special event, the first gathering of their new diversity and inclusion program for aspiring pilots. As he walked through the lobby, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This was the kind of lasting change he had hoped for, not just for himself, but for the industry as a whole. The event was held in a large conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the busy runways. Inside, a group of about 30 young pilots, men and women from a variety of backgrounds, sat in neat rows, listening intently as an executive introduced the program. Their faces were a mix of nervousness and excitement, the same emotions John had felt when he first entered the world of aviation. John was introduced as the keynote speaker, and the room filled with applause as he took the stage. He smiled, feeling a surge of energy as he looked out at the group of eager faces before him. "Good morning," John began, his voice steady but warm. "I'm honored to be here today to speak with all of you, because I see myself in each one of you. When I first started my career as a pilot, I faced a lot of challenges. Some of those challenges came from the difficulty of the job itself, but many came from the way people saw me, what they expected or didn't expect, based on the color of my skin." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But I'm standing here today because I refuse to let those expectations define me. I worked hard, stayed focused, and proved time and time again that I belonged in the cockpit. And each of you will face your own set of challenges too. Some because of your gender, some because of your race, some because of your background. But I want you to remember something important. You do belong here." The room was silent, every eye on him, hanging on his words. "The world is changing," John continued. "We're pushing for a more inclusive, more diverse industry, one that's fair for everyone. But change doesn't happen overnight. It happens with every small step we take, every barrier we break down, every time someone like you decides to stand up and say, 'I'm here and I deserve to be.'" A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "How did you keep going when things got tough, when people doubted you?" John smiled. "I won't lie to you. It wasn't always easy. There were days when I felt like giving up, when I wondered if I'd ever be accepted. But what kept me going was my passion for flying and the belief that I had something valuable to offer. And I knew that if I could just keep pushing, I could open the door a little wider for the people who would come after me." He gestured to the group. "You're those people. You're the next generation of pilots who will reshape this industry. And my job, and the job of this program, is to help you succeed. But it's up to you to take that opportunity and run with it." The young pilots nodded, their faces lit with determination. John could see their potential, and it filled him with hope for the future. As the event concluded, several of the pilots approached John to thank him. Among them was a young black man named Eric, whose enthusiasm reminded John of himself at the start of his career. "Captain Bennett," Eric said, his voice brimming with excitement, "I just want to say thank you. Hearing your story today, it gives me hope. I've wanted to be a pilot my whole life, but sometimes it feels like the world is telling me I don't belong. But after hearing you, I know I do." John smiled warmly, placing a hand on Eric's shoulder. "You absolutely belong here, Eric, and don't ever forget that." As John left the event, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had spent so many years fighting for his place in the industry, but now it wasn't just about his journey. It was about helping others along theirs. This was his new flight path, and he embraced it wholeheartedly. It was late in the afternoon, and the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light over the airport runways. John stood by a large window in Delta's headquarters, watching as planes took off and landed. It was a sight he had seen thousands of times, but it never lost its magic. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter, Simone. "How did it go today, Dad?" John smiled as he typed his response. "It was incredible. These young pilots, they're going to change everything." "You're changing everything," she replied. "Proud of you." John stared at the message for a moment, feeling a swell of emotion. He hadn't sought out this role of advocate and mentor, but now that he was in it, he realized it was exactly where he needed to be. Not only had he proven himself as a pilot, but he had become a symbol of what was possible when you refused to let the world define you by its limited expectations. As he gazed out at the runway, his thoughts drifted back to the day of the emergency landing. That day had been a turning point, not just for the passengers and crew on that flight, but for John himself. He had always known that he was capable of flying a plane under extreme circumstances, but he hadn't expected that moment to become a catalyst for change. Behind him, the door to the room opened, and David Parker, Delta's senior operations manager, entered. "John," David said, walking over to stand beside him at the window, "I just wanted to thank you again for everything you've done. You've really helped us see things in a new way, and I think we're on the right path." John nodded, appreciating the sentiment. It's a good start, David, but there's still a lot of work to be done. David smiled. I know, and we're committed to it. This is just the beginning. As they spoke, a group of young pilots, including Eric, walked by, heading toward the training simulators. They waved at John, their faces bright with excitement. David watched them for a moment, then turned back to John. You've made a real difference here, you know. John looked at the group of aspiring pilots and felt a sense of pride, but also responsibility. I hope so, he said quietly. But the real difference will be when the industry doesn't just talk about change, when it lives it, when pilots like them don't have to fight so hard to prove they belong. David nodded thoughtfully. We're getting there, John, slowly but surely. They stood in silence for a moment, watching as another plane lifted off the runway and soared into the sky. John thought about his own journey, the obstacles he had faced, and the moments of doubt. But he also thought about the people who had supported him along the way, the mentors and allies who had believed in him even when others didn't. He knew that change didn't happen overnight. It took time, persistence, and a willingness to stand up for what was right. But he also knew that every step forward, no matter how small, brought them closer to a future where every pilot, no matter their race, gender, or background, would be judged by their abilities, not by their appearance. David's voice broke the silence. By the way, I heard Sarah's been working with the new diversity team. She's been really pushing for change from within. John raised an eyebrow, surprised. Sarah? Really? David nodded. Yeah. After everything that happened, she took it hard. She's been determined to learn from it and help fix the system. It's been surprising, but in a good way. John smiled faintly, remembering the way Sarah had approached him with her apology after the emergency landing. He had been skeptical at the time, unsure if her remorse was genuine or just a reaction to the gravity of the situation. But hearing that she had taken steps to better herself and to make amends gave him hope. People can change, John said quietly, if they really want to. David glanced at him, then nodded. Yeah, they can. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, John felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that the work was far from over. There were still challenges ahead, still prejudices to confront and barriers to break down. But he also knew that progress was being made, one step at a time. And perhaps most importantly, he knew that his journey wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the future. It was about ensuring that the next generation of pilots, people like Eric, and the others he had met, would have a smoother path than he had. It was about creating a world where people were judged not by their appearance, but by their character, their skills, and their heart. As the last rays of sunlight faded, John turned to David. It's been a long journey, he said, but we're getting there. David smiled, clapping him on the back. We sure are. John's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Alex, the flight attendant who had been so supportive during the emergency landing. Saw your speech today, the message read. Inspiring as always. Let's grab coffee soon and talk more about the new programs. John smiled, typing back a quick response. Looking forward to it. As he put his phone away, John felt a profound sense of purpose. His journey as a pilot had been filled with highs and lows, moments of triumph and moments of doubt. But now, standing on the other side of it all, he knew that he had made a difference. Not just by landing a plane in a crisis, but by standing up for what was right and helping others find their way.